Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Alan. Alan, if you want to come up here, one of our frickin' greats. He's an internationally recognized New York-based artist, Gayenge Haga, from Six Nations. He's been working for over 20 years in kinds of practices that are socially engaged, critically aware, working with archives and working with new media. And we currently have on view a wonderful work that we're going to talk about. But Alan also has another side of him, which is all the activism he does on behalf of the indigenous arts community within New York and internationally. And we are eternally grateful for all the work you've been doing for so long. So, thank you. But I didn't want to make you sound old. So here's one of your beautiful balls. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. There's four big balls in this show. No, they're globes. They're beautiful globes. But I first saw this work in Venice with the last Biennale, and maybe we can start there in terms of how you came to be thinking about colonialism from Italy and Venice.
Well, it came through an invitation to think about Venice as a site of colonial exploration, early colonial exploration. Venice was the home to cartographers and early explorers like Caboto, and also had a very strong publishing industry there at the time that was publishing the early accounts of what they were calling the New World, which of course was not new at all. And you know, I tend to make work that incorporates archival materials. So this was really right up my alley, right up my lane. And yeah, and there were a few things, a few historical things that I turned up that became inspirations for the work. And this is one of them, actually. So in 1725, two Louisiana natives were captured and brought to the court of Louis XIV and commanded to dance. And so gave a dance performance that was called them performing, excuse me, a war dance, but who knows if it was a war dance or not. The composer, Jean-Philippe Rameau, the famous Baroque composer, was in the audience, and he was really sort of struck by this dancing and the rhythms and so forth. And so he went off and wrote a harpsichord suite called Les Sauvages, the Savages, based on that. And it's something that, if you know Baroque art, it moves. It's not stationary like Renaissance art and sort of nailed down by perspective. And so I think he really went with that. And so what I did was I found this beautiful footage of a young Haudenosaunee dancer just dancing on the street, supposedly doing one of our old-fashioned war dances. And I had a friend record always war dances, but this was authentic. And I substituted the traditional singing and drum that he was dancing to Rameau's harpsichord piece. So there's this strange interchange between the dancer, and you get a real sense of the colonial imaginary in its musical form. And Rameau later went on, it became a popular piece. He later went on to expand it into an opera ballet that was like a colonial fantasy. And that soundtrack is also in this work. In fact, it's in this one, yeah. So they're all sort of subtitled.
See how I do that? You know, it's just like right on the ready.
It's magical, yeah. So they're sort of subtitled, and this one's I call Viaggi, Voyages. And it basically is a sort of mashup of all this historical material that shows the trajectory of exploration and colonization. It ends Haudenosaunee village that's already under a missionary sort of cross, little church there. So this was an opportunity to just sort of, really look at history and try to condense 500 years of history into 12 minutes, which is, what I did. And we can go on to the next one. The next one. This is the very end of the next one. This one is actually I called War Dance, and it's also a mashup of all these stereotypical images of natives as savages, as bloodthirsty warriors. That is being countered by the way that I use material to tell a very different narrative, and that's the sort of thing I've been doing for over 30 years. So this is, you can see there's actually, I used layering, and in many respects, this work is imitating, in a way, the projection of European power and European sort of greed and colonial mindedness. So there's a way in which projection becomes a sort of metaphor, projection onto these globes of power. But of course, the projections that I'm trying to show is a projection of a very different kind of power, of red power. So it ends in a much softer, gentler, one more slide, please. One that's accompanied by hymn sung in Mohawk. It's quite a beautiful performance, and it's just it's basically just all sorts of images of us that are not typically stereotyped that way. It's much more positive.
Yeah, it seems like there's really key figures from your community in here.
Yes, and going back, quite a ways. So that's what I tend to do, is mix the present and in a way, the implied future, as Greg was so articulate about, with the past. America's now going through this whole debate about history, mainly because it's ignored its own history for however many years. I think it was Gore Vidal that called it the United States of amnesia, and I think that's pretty much where it's at. So that's been another sort of project of my work, is to get people to look at that, and not in a dry sort of historical framework, but again, from the last panel, in ways that bypasses all that and moves you, and that's part of art's power, is to sort of hit you in the head and the heart at the same time, or it can. So, yeah.
But that amnesia that you're battling, in a sense, is a very self-serving amnesia. Like it's a necessary amnesia in order for land extraction, right?
Yes, I mean it's based on this whole rickety foundation of sort of fake law, based on papal bulls and dividing the world between Spain and Portugal, and it's amazing the United States law is still based on those documents, the doctrine of discovery, which on its face is completely ridiculous. I mean, you can't discover people that are already there. You can't discover Turtle Island because it's been there. I mean, it's like, so that's.
What, so I want to just come back to layering for a second before we move on, because I think it's one of the ways in which you are able to make a very complex narrative with very diverse materials, but that flows from beginning to end, so it's understandable. So here, for example, there are animals, the turtle's starting to come across the face here, and what's happening there?
So I use sort of overlays in this work, I think more than I ever have. In some respects, when you project on anything, there's an overlay, and I tend to not project on normal, flat screens or surfaces. So in this case, I was layering the 3 clan animals of Mohawk people, you know, the bear, wolf, and turtle. But these drawings were done by one of those missionary priests, you know, very early on. So they sort of, you know, come in from the side and come in from different angles. Yeah, it moves, you know. It's not just you know, stationary, sort of boring historical maps or even portraits. Everything is sort of moving and circulating.
Is there something you learned through your research about, you know, the atlas? Because it kind of starts with the first kind of world atlas, right? And then the notion you have in the title, like theater of the world.
Yeah, I took that title, which is, you know, arrogant in itself, right? The Theatrum, Orbis, Terrarum. It's Latin for theater of the world. And it's the title of, you know, the first modern world atlas, which is in its 451st year. And you get a lot from that. You get a lot just from that title of a sense of entitlement, a sense of, really of drama, of what was going to come in a way. And theater is also used in warfare, like the theater of battle or something, warfare. So I just thought it was, you know, an apt title. I also was interested in, I don't know if we have a slide of it, but can we move forward? No, I guess not. There's an image, it's an illustration from Solarius's atlas that is an illustration of the Copernican heliocentric, that's the sun in the middle sort of universe. And it shows a sun in the middle and then 4 orbs. And it's shining on the faces, you know, of 4 orbs. So it gave me the idea for, you know, okay, so the sun is now 4 projectors, and the light is the light of truth and the truth in history rather than something else. So yeah, that was that.
Did you learn anything about colonialism that you didn't already know when you were doing all this research?
Well, you know, there's a certain seductive quality of these maps and things like that. So it's a funny thing. It's like you play with it for a while, and you know, it's the same with the music. It's very attractive in a funny way. So I think there's something insidious about that, and when you combine it with all the you know, the ideology that we've all been fed, it's no wonder that it's United States of Amnesia, because it's a pretty good marketing job, you know.
I think another thing we were talking about was, you know, there's a lot of controversy over archives, right? And how do we go about gleaning ourselves through an archive that was written to erase us? So, and I think you've done that with this work. Like, there is something you've shown about how we do that.
Yeah, you can use the archive against itself. It's a kind of jujitsu, you know, just, yeah, I've been doing that for a while. I like things to be based in fact, because you can't get stranger than the history that's been normalized, how strange it is. In fact, if we go to the next slide, we can talk about, this will lead into this new work that I'm doing for the same show that Peter was talking about at MoMA PS1, the current Greater New York show that's up through April. So if you get down to New York, hope you'll see it. And also to Peter's point, like, there are 5 natives in that show now, and there's 47 artists in the show. So things have changed a bit. So this is an artist's rendering of pre-contact, or, you know, pre-colonial Manhattan. And you see a pretty large pond with a little sort of tail pond to it. A pond that the Dutch called collect, and that was the original. It was a large spring-fed pond with wetlands and an outlet to the Hudson and to the East River. And you know, it was clearly they were thinking of it as a native site, which it probably was. And one evidence that it was that there was a huge shell midden, a mound of oyster shells, on its western shore. And this pond, you know, was the original source of drinking water for the colony and so forth. But within, less than 200 years, they had polluted it by allowing tanneries and distilleries and slaughterhouses to locate on its banks. And so they poisoned it, and then they decided to bury it. There's not a sign of it left. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what prompted this whole project that I did for the Public Art Fund. We're talking 1989, going back. So I came across this image in a historical book, Pictorial History of New York, and I'm trying to place this large hill in this pond, or in lake in Lower Manhattan, and I couldn't. And then I eventually did the research and found out what it was. I think you can even see the shell midden on the opposite shore there, behind that sort of blue roofed house there. And so the hill was leveled to fill it. The pond was drained along the stream that eventually became Canal Street. The canal was the thing that they used to drain it. And the midden was bulldozed, in their technology way on it. And then once it was filled in on the sort of grave site, they built the notorious Tombs prison, which was also an execution ground. So that sequence from this, spring-fed pond that was supporting so much life, not just native life, but just think of all the life that a pond supports. For that to be its fate in less than 200 years, I think is pretty instructive as to certain sorts of attitudes that were brought here, that were not here, but were brought here.
Yeah, it's reminding me of what Duke was talking about this morning, even when he was saying like these different ways of thinking about the land and how to live with it or on it or destroy it. There is an irony, like to this history that you've excavated, and it particularly in the fact that it gets covered with a jail and courts.
Yeah, it's surrounded by courts right now. So I did a piece. Could we move on the slide? Actually, this is a present leftover shell midden that's in Maine, and you can see how big it was. And can we go one further? Yeah, and in 1998. An even larger one was found just north of New York City in Dobbs Ferry when they were excavating for a condominium. And it was originally dated at something like 4,000 years old, but they recently recarbon dated whatever was left of it to 6950 BCE, which makes it almost 9,000 years old. And of course, they just, they excavated it and they built the condominium. They left a little sort of token area of it, but they found something like 50,000 objects, which I hope they didn't throw away. But anyways, that's that. So how do I just...
Oh, should I just do it again?
Yeah, you should do it.
You're a tech guy. What the hell?
Well, I wasn't sure which one there. You want to turn it off.
Green means go.
Okay, well, thought I hit that. Okay, so this is so this idea of this missing midden haunted me, and it germinated for years. And when I was invited to be in Greater New York, for some reason I just thought, okay, I'm going to try to do it now. And I researched and I found this nonprofit on Governor's Island called the Billion Oyster Project. And that's literally their project, is to reseed the harbor with live oysters. Oysters clean water. So one oyster can clean up to 50 gallons of polluted water a day. So anyways, they collect shells from area restaurants and they dry them in the sun on Governor's Island, and they lent me 3 tons of shell to do my next project, which if we can go forward. So I like to get out on boats and look at New York from and other places from the water. And this was a very polluted creek. This is the sort of the head of it near the East River. That's called Newtown Creek. That I once sailed up 20 years ago when I did my first video installation where I projected onto a huge screen of white turkey feathers that I made. Anyways, I went back in there. Next slide. And, you know, there's these sorts of middens now. This is modern middens. And keep going. Yeah, and I did this work. So this is like about 29 feet of shell that's arranged in the base of a two-story gallery at PS1. They call it the duplex gallery. It's a little distorted in terms of, I think in terms of proportion, but it's very long. It's about 7 feet to the wall from the front of it, and it raises up to about 2 feet high. So it's like a big minimalist sculpture, you know, a big wedge-shaped minimalist sculpture that I then projected this moving video that I had shot from boats of this creek, which again once was great oyster grounds, and the site of oyster middens, and the site of a village at the head of this creek. Next slide.
So this is made, just to be clear, from 3,000 tons of oyster shell?
3 tons of oyster shell. So that's
6,000.
6,000 pounds of shell. Yeah.
Suddenly the building is in the earth.
No, it was on a...
3 tons, 3 tons.
Yeah, it was on the base, you know, it was a very secure base of this old school. So you can see more middens, you know, that I was passing this was in the Gowanus, they call it, the Gowanus Canal. Also very polluted, although they're building luxury housing there, so maybe they'll clean it up. And you can see it, it's visible from 3 different levels. When you go into PS1, you're on the main level, and there are 2 big openings, and you look down into this gallery, sort of toward the basement where it's located. So this is the view from looking down at it. But if we go to the next slide, you can see some detail here actually of the oyster shells. And the closer you get to it, the more the shells take over. So there's a bit of a sort of a conflict, a little struggle between the shells and all of this overlay, right? And that's, again, projection as metaphor, projection as sculpture, in a way. Because when it hits all this stuff, it just changes. It's pretty strange. Anyways, the next one. So there's actually 2 levels to the basement. Once you get down there, there's a sort of stairwell landing, and then a few stairs down to the bottom. So this was just a couple weeks ago. I gave a tour to the Viralis Center people that I work with. And then next slide, please. And this is if you're just right down there with it. Yeah.
It's amazing.
One more, please. Yeah. And another. Yeah. So again, the closer you get to it, the more the shells really speak. And so I become this sort of vehicle for them to speak. And it was wonderful working with the Billion Oyster Project because they're doing such good work there. And there's a thing called the New York Harbor School, which is a public high school that teach students the maritime trades. So they were driving the boat that I went out on, and it was great. Okay, so we can move on.
Okay. Yeah. He's like running the show now. No,
well, I mean, I didn't, you know.
I'm just messing with you, hon.
Yeah.
So you've been working on an exhibition.
Yes.
At Columbia in the art
Yes.
gallery there with
Yes.
4 incredible indigenous women artists. And I know it's like coming from dealing with collections, but going way beyond that. So start where you'd like.
Well, you know, I was invited to curate. This is the first actual exhibition that I've ever curated. I've curated programming, but not exhibitions. And, I actually went as an undergraduate to Columbia like 50 years ago. and so I just wasn't aware that they even had a collection. It's an odd collection. It's not it's not an art museum. It's a study collection that's housed in a library. And so I was curious about it, and I just thought, okay, well, I'll see what they have and how to do it. And anyways, my idea was, Greg spoke very eloquently about honoring, and that's how I approached this. I approached these objects that were orphaned in this collection, not as like the trophies of colonialism, but as sort of relatives, and the best thing I could do to honor them would be to free them, however temporarily, from the sort of compartments they were in Avery Hall, but not only physical compartments, but the compartmentalization of settler colonial collection, And I thought one way to further that would be to invite tribal descendants I selected 4 objects from the 4 sort of corners of Turtle Island, and then I invited, in this case we're looking at another cradle board there, a Mohawk cradle board from the mid-19th century, and then above it is a still from Scowanati's The Peacemaker Returns. So I invited a Mohawk artist to show with that. And then the next one is Wendy Red Star, and there's a pair of wedding moccasins from the collection that we believe are Absaloka, which is her group, also known as Crow. And she did this amazing series called Accession that is also an exploration of collection. Can we get to the next one? And also for the North, I invited Sonia Kelleher Combs to show her amazing latest Credible. She did this series called Credible a couple years ago, where she locates on these different panels, I think there's 35 of them, the sites of places where Alaskan Natives were abused by members of the Catholic Church, by priests and officials and so forth. And they're shown with some Inupiaq drawings that were done under the tutelage of missionaries in the 1890s. One more slide. Yeah, and you can see this is the little brochure. So they have a beautiful child's blanket, and all these I selected objects that had to do with children one way or another. And this is a child's blanket, Diné, or Navajo child's blanket, from the 1870s sort of period. That was, their long walk and all that. And so I invited Dakota Mace, who's a Diné artist, who works across different, she works in photography and printmaking and also weaving. So I'm showing a print. She did the black and red print over there is our 2 residential school students, and then she wove this sash, this child sash that are given to the person when it's, when they come of age. And her grandfather did the silver work, and her grandfather was a residential school student who, again, hadn't talked about it, that sort of thing. So anyways, that's the show, and it's going to be up for months if you find yourself in New York and want to go up to Columbia and see some stuff. It's in a brand new building, a Renzo Piano designed building. It's got its own floor. It's a beautiful gallery.
I just want to come back to a few things you talked about here. Thinking about the notion of object relations and the notion of relationality and all of our relations, the way we talk. That came up in Maria Hupfield's panel earlier. How we're trying to bring this kind of understanding of relationality into the center of this kind of work if we're talking about our belongings that are inside a museum. So can you talk a bit about that? Like, I understand that you're making relation, like literal relation between an artist and belonging, but it goes further than that.
Yes, it does. I mean, first of all, I think that if you think of these objects as somehow holding our lifeblood, somehow more than just a thing, and that's holding our traditions, then I think this idea of sort of relation can become, both literal and metaphorical. And I think it's showing powerful, continuities. These objects are not only marooned in their little compartments, but they're also rarely ever contextualized, enough. So I think this contextualizes enough, especially Wendy's piece, which shows, these objects. If we can go further ahead, actually, there's some more. Yeah. So this is. Hasn't been completely, well, it's just opened today. It wasn't completely lit when I got this slide, but.
You're the first audience.
Yeah, it's the Mohawk cradle board with Scawanati's Peacemaker Returns. Next one, please. Yeah, so this is the moccasins with Wendy's work. And so one more, please, yeah. So you can see that she's basically used watercolors that were painted by anonymous WPA artists, the artists in the 30s that were hired by the federal government, who cataloged these objects in color, in watercolor, and she blew up those as backdrops to photographs she took at the Crow Fair of people, wearing these objects or using these objects. So again, I think it was an opportunity to show these vital aspects of culture, not dead or historical at all, but in fact quite alive and quite beautiful.
I think that there's also maybe a bit of a connection between this notion of the way you're looking at these materials and the way in which you are kind of making layering historically. So if you because it's how meaning is made. It's like projection and new media is one way that we can create meaning through new connections. Mm-hmm. So meaning just expands and expands and expands as opposed to becomes a singular thing. That was a little esoteric. I'm so sorry.
No, it's true. I think it provides a sort of rich canvas that's beyond just one layer of canvas. I used to be a painter, and now I'm spoiled by video because I can shoot something in 12 minutes. There's like 1,000 paintings that go by, so.
That's very true. And then the notion of classification that they have within the museum system also connects to the earlier work in terms of being a fundamental aspect of colonization. And then thinking about the way that they classify land as not a relation, and how that's part of the same system.
Yes, I mean, I think that, exporting those attitudes about land and about property here, is at the root of it all, really, because it doesn't mesh very well with the way that our people were living, and I think still, in a way, would probably prefer to live, in a lot of ways. Everybody was speaking very sort of, not exactly apologetically, but sort of like, well, I had to, make polar bears to survive, and, if you think about the way Manhattan and that whole, series of sort of islands and estuaries and so forth was laid out. One environmentalist who did a major project called Mannahatta said, if you just came upon this before it was developed, you'd make it into a national park. But that wouldn't have necessarily worked for us anyways, because when they made Yellowstone or something like that, they just, threw everybody out. It wasn't this fantasy of wilderness and empty land. It was occupied, so.
I think that's the only way that this society understands nature is as a park, in a way.
Yeah, and that's Sonia's work on this curved wall. It's sort of almost like the curve of the earth somehow with her maps and sewn human hair and thread. It's a beautiful piece. Facing it is the Anupiak drawings from the 1890s. I think there might be, is there one more? Yeah. This is the installation of the child's blanket with Dakota Mace's print and woven belt.
Since this is your first show inside of a gallery, is there a connection between what you're doing and your own practice as an artist? Do you think you see differently?
No, because I think, if you could see like the folders that I have of source material, before I do something like the Theater of the World, it's almost like curation in a way. It's building narrative through, in a way, a sort of groups of sequences that tell certain stories and things like that. So it wasn't difficult. I just felt, yeah, I know how to do that. So, yeah.
One thing I've always admired about your work is that the form that it takes, whatever the form is key to the meaning of the piece. It's not incidental, Sorry, I know I love your curation, but I want to come back to your work. If you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, it's an opportunity. I think that in my lifetime, you can't choose when you're born and so forth, and you can't choose when you sort of enter as a young artist the sort of stream, the river of art, And you're always taught by the previous generation, and the previous generation that taught me were formalists, dyed-in-the-wool color field painters and things like that. And so, I learned a lot from them, but, modernism suppressed content in a lot of ways, or that era of modernism was suppressing content. And I think that, contents come roaring back, but it's not good enough to just present content. So then you're looking for that marriage of form and content that would, that is art, yeah, that where both are happy, sort of, Yeah, but, I've also explored these forms that also have sort of metaphorical meaning for me, too. Like, I've worked in panoramic format a lot, and what I like about that, besides the sort of resemblance to, wampum belts, the sort of, if you put them horizontally, is that you can't really take it in one gulp, like you can so many paintings. It's environmental. It invites you to move and change your perspective as you move. It's not just one vanishing point. It has to be, and any extension in space is extension in time. So then you have time, and that's a beautiful thing to exploit besides space. So that's the sort of thing, the reasons that I've been playing with this stuff for years.
You did say that you are interested in facts, like starting from the place of facts. I have two things I want to understand about that, and one is you don't present facts, though, like in your work as a straightforward thing. And why is that? And I think it connects this notion of theater, too.
Well, I think it's, again, it's a process, like research is part of my process, but it's not the research of an academic. It's much more, it's a freer process than that, and I'm not held to those sorts of, proofs and things. Then it becomes a process of editing, and incorporating things in a way that, that creates something that's moving rather than something that's factual, like in some sort of dry way, like a dry history. So. You
want people to feel it, to experience it.
Yeah, I mean, again, like that sequence of collect pond, you couldn't make that up. You just it's like if you did a comic book of that, it would be wild, right?
Yeah.
It's like so. The kinds of histories that I have, so I look at sites, and again, I've been very land-centered in my work for over 30 years. When I started doing this sort of work in the late 80s, not that many people were doing it. It's now a staple of all biennales, that people, regress sites and talk about the colonial aspects of things. But I've just been doing it, and I don't know.
What do you think happens in society? Like if New Yorkers were actually to really face the erasures that has happened and the violence to the land, and every violence to the land is the violence to people and other beings. What do you think that what would happen, or why is that so hard,
Well, look, there's a lot of, entrenched interests that control our politicians, and the politicians are very insulated from the people, and they then rig the elections so that they stay elected and so forth. So it's a pretty corrupt system generally. But I'm hopeful that organizations like the Billion Oyster Project, for example, I think we have to make coalitions. I think we have to work with others who are, hopefully have similar goals. And we have to teach them how to work with us, because they often, again, even very progressive organizations and historically environmental organizations have, displayed a sort of unconscious or even conscious racism, and make us into what Paul Chatt-Smith sort of called forest bunnies. Like, we're the avatars of some sort of unspoiled thing, like that kitschy commercial of the native crying and the garbage and all that stuff. So I think it's a work in progress, and I think there's some reasons to be hopeful, and so I'm hopeful, and art can be that.
But at the same time, I would cry if I saw that.
Yeah.
Toronto has a similar history in terms of these buried creeks and rivers that they just turned into a sewage system, and it's like glacier water, right? The cleanest, most beautiful water in the world, and it's now our sewage system.
Yeah.
So what are you working on now?
I'm going to work on resting. I think it's been a hectic few months, but I'm looking forward to doing some stuff with you next year with the Abaquad in Venice.
Yeah, hopefully this will be the third Abaquad. That'll be a COVID Abaquad in Venice in April 21st to the 26th.
But I'm also, Wendy Red Star co-edited an issue not this past fall, but the fall before, called Native America for Aperture magazine, storied photography magazine. And it's now going to be an exhibition that's going to open at the Princeton Art Museum in February. And I have a new suite of photographs. I did a photographic series. I actually did something that's framed and you can hang on the wall for a change, So that's coming up, and Mick Migwans is curating a show at the U of T, which I'm also have a piece in that, something I made for a show in 1990. Yeah, COVID's been weird.
What's that piece?
It's a piece called Blanket Refusal. And it was made for a show called Citizenship, a Practice of Society, that was at the MCA Denver in 2020. And what I did was I printed the Onondaga chief's letter to the president in 1924, basically refusing this gift of United States citizenship, saying, we're already citizens, and how can we be citizens when we have a treaty with you? And by the way, remember that treaty? That sort of thing. And so I reproduced it on 2 fleece blankets in purple and white with bars of purple, that 2-row thing. So that will be in that. Yeah.
That 2-row thing for people.
Yeah.
It's become so well known, right?
Yeah, it's a motif.
We can just say that.
Yeah, I think people, hopefully, the 2. If you don't know it, you shouldn't be in here. No, it's 2 bars of. 2 bars of purple against a field of white, 2 rows of purple against a field of white. And it stands for an early agreement we made with the Dutch and the Europeans that were moving into our lands. And the idea was we're all on the same river, and you in your sailing ship and we in our canoes, and let's agree to not try to get in each other's boats or each other's way or steer each other, that sort of thing. So the idea is peaceful coexistence, you know, and see how well that worked out.
That's actually one of my a work of yours that I fell in love with that Greg Hill bought for the National Gallery collection, which is that huge, you know, I think it's 4 channels or 5?
It's 4 channels, yeah. It's 2-row too.
Projection
Yeah.
of the 2-row, but the river, because it's shot on the
Grand.
Of the Grand, but it's
Yeah.
going backwards. So you got one going this way and one going that way, which is the, you know.
Yeah, cross purposes, yeah. And you have the river as a fence instead of as some sort of common area. It's, you know, one bank is the reserve, Six Nations Reserve, and the other is the non-native townships. So, yeah.
And I think that's the moment, right? We're not going in the same direction anymore. But
No.
not until the treaties are honored and the land is given back and, you know, we learn our histories.
Grass is green, sky is blue, all that. Nice poetry, but you gotta mean it.
Okay, well, thank you so much,
Oh,
Alan.
thank you.
Big hand for Alan.
Nyawe.
So please go to the second floor to see the work.